a Sydney woman who became a volunteer ambulance driver during the First World War. She was unable to serve in the British Army, so she financed her own way to the conflict, even buying the ambulance in the process. She sought travel and adventure and found it on the remote Balkans front. Welcome to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast. I'm Ross Manuel, I'm an amateur historian and writer, and on this episode I look into the life, service and legacy of Sergeant Olive May Kelso King, who served as an ambulance driver within the Serbian Army during the First World War. Olive May King was born the 30th of June 1885 in Croydon, Sydney, the youngest daughter of Sir George Kelso King, a prominent Sydney businessman, and his first wife, Irene Isabella Ryan. Despite her father's well-documented life, there's little known of Olive's formative years, but what is known is that she was educated primarily at home, but also boarded at the Kambala Church of England School in 1902 and 1903. In 1900, her mother died, and Sir Kelso sent her to Europe to study in German and Swiss schools. Life and study in Europe enabled her to become fluent in French and German, as well as a skilled mountain climber and skier. Susanna de Vries, the author of Heroic Australian Women in War, states Olive was born in a period when intelligence and independence were not valued in young women. Instead, marriage and motherhood were seen as their destiny. Exposed to the world with little desire at the time for traditional women's roles, Olive became a keen adventurer. In 1910, with 3 male companions, she climbed Mount Popocatépetl in Mexico. She also developed an interest in motoring, including mechanics and rally driving throughout her 20s. By the outbreak of the First World War, Olive had moved to England to help her sister Sunny, who had just given birth, and wishing to contribute to the war in some way, she sought her father's blessing, and in early 1915, she purchased and retrofitted a 3-litre French Outer lorry into a 16-seater ambulance, and nicknamed it Ella, short for Ella-fant, referring to the heavy effect the ambulance bodywork had done on slowing the Alder from its usual sporty 40 miles per hour to a lumbering 30. So attached to this vehicle, an engraving of it resided on the reverse side of Olive's identity bracelet. She booked passage for Ella and herself to Belgium, where she joined the Allied Fields Ambulance Corps. Her initial time in the war in this capacity was somewhat limited, as within months of arriving she would be abandoned by the Corps for conflicting reasons. Some sources say that the organisers of the Ambulance Corps were implicated by the Belgian government for espionage, while others say it was the Germans who accused them of spying. One consistent theme throughout all these stories, though, is that Olive and a number of other women within the group were detained on suspicion of espionage in their stead. However, it's not 100% clear on who actually was detaining them. Sadly, I cannot find a definitive answer either way, as even trying to find information about the Allied Fields Ambulance Corps or the espionage charges, save for references to Olive and 2 other women, it's incredibly difficult due to how common these terms are. So if anyone knows more about this group, please feel free to contact the podcast. In any rate, the Corps took Ella back to England and left Olive in Belgium. Thankfully, due to her proficiency in French and German, she was able to convince the authorities to release her and allowed her to escape before the approaching German army. She made her way back to England and was able to be reunited with Ella. She then convinced her father that she would find a safer way to be part of the war, and promptly attempted to join the British Expeditionary Force. However, she would come up against an obstacle. At the time, the British authorities were not allowing women to register for foreign service. So not to be deterred, she instead travelled north and signed up with the Scottish Women's Hospitals for foreign service in May 1915. Returning to France with the Girton and Newham unit, she would stay there for 6 months before the Scottish Women's Hospital was relocated via the SS Masol to Salonika in Macedonia to assist Serbian forces on the Salonika Front in the Balkans with their fight against the Central Powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Bulgaria. During the Second World War, the world was loosely broken up into 2 coalitions, the Axis and Allied powers. During the Great War, the world was broken up more or less along the same lines, but with the names Central Powers, also known as the Central Empires, comprising of Germany and her empire, Austria-Hungary and her empire, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, plus their client states and supporters, and was formed out of the pre-war coalition known as the Triple Alliance. They waged their war against the industrial juggernaut known as the Allied or Entente powers, which consisted of the coalition of the United Kingdom and her empire, the French Republic and her empire, Russia and her empire, Japan and the United States of America, along with their client states and supporters. Italy and her empire also sided with the Entente, despite initially siding with the Central Powers before 1915. When you actually look at a map of the two belligerent groups in this conflict, about 80% of the world's population easily sides with the Entente powers. On the 3rd of November, the Scottish Women's Hospital moved up to Jevgelija on the Greco-Serbian border, where they established a hospital. After 6 weeks, they were forced to dismantle it hurriedly before the advancing Central Powers. And once again, Olive found herself abandoned, along with 2 other women drivers, when the medical and nursing staff were evacuated. However, she was able to get Ella on the last train out of town before the station was bombed. With Serbia falling to Central Forces in December, the Entente forces regrouped in Salonika. While the Scottish Women's Hospital would open a tent hospital there, by 1916 they had left the country. Olive, however, decided to remain and joined what remained of the Serbian Army that year as a driver attached to the medical headquarters in Salonika. During her service, she often drove her ambulance for extended hours over tortuous roads, worked amid the debris of war, and lived rough. She worked tirelessly, often required to do mechanical work and consistently repairing punctures on the old ambulance. A couple of times, she actually narrowly escaped capture. She mastered Serbian on the job, so to speak, and lived in a hut made from an aeroplane case. For a time, Ella was the only vehicle available to transport hospital stores, take equipment and reinforcements to the front line 12 miles away, and then return with patients. Towards the end of 1916, Olive contracted malaria, and one of her most frequent visitors was Captain Milan Jovicic, as the Serbian liaison officer with the British Army. They fell in love and saw each other almost every day, until October 1917, when he was posted to London. Jovicic gave her a sterling silver cigarette case as a memento of their affair, which had been the subject of gossip around Salonika. In April 1917, for all the perilous work she had done for the Serbian army, she was promoted to sergeant. In August, when fire destroyed much of the predominantly wood construction of Salonika, she drove for approximately 20 hours at a stretch, often in danger transporting civilians, medical personnel, patients, and hospital records to safety. For this, she was awarded the Serbian Silver Medal for bravery. A year later, she received the Gold Medal for zealous conduct. Back in Australia, her exploits were regularly chronicled in the papers, owing mainly due to her father's influence. Though, and I do apologise to any paramedics that may be listening, she is repeatedly referred to as an ambulance driver, or worse, an ambulance chauffeur. It is unclear about how much medical training she actually did possess at this time, or if she was simply using Ella to transport the wounded from aid stations to hospitals and not treating them herself. She would also use his influence for more philanthropic purposes. Long distressed by the plight of the Serbian soldiers and civilians, Olive appealed to her father for money to set up canteens. A committee was formed under him and quickly raised £10,000, which she administered in the first Serbian-Australian canteen in Belgrade in late 1918, and opened 17 similar canteens to sell food, blankets, clothing, and other necessities at cost price or below. When the war ended on the 11th of November 1918, Olive would be released from the Serbian army the following April. In that time, she predominantly facilitated the canteens. Obtaining and transporting supplies presented great problems for her because the railway system was in chaos following the bombing and reconstruction efforts. Many of the time, the roads were impassable and bridges had already been destroyed. Often, she had to sleep on top of the stores in railway trucks and lorries and wagons to fend off any marauding thieves. The Sunday Times from the 4th of January 1920 states, Miss Olive Kelso King, who will be remembered as having done such excellent transport work in Serbia during the war, and is still working for that suffering. She is traveling with relief canteens and intends to continue until the need for it ends. That end would come soon, as the last canteen would close in June 1920. For all this work, Olive was awarded the Samaritan Cross and the Cross of the Order of St. Sava, personally bestowed upon her by King Alexander. Her father's failing health prompted her to return to Australia to be with him, and while there, she took up the post as State Secretary for the New South Wales Girl Guides Association. A woman of her position in society was not allowed to take up paid work, and this organisation was important to her stepmother and father. She would rise through the ranks within that organisation and became the Assistant States Commissioner from 1932 to 1942. And she would return to Belgrade in 1922 as the special guest at the wedding of King Alexander and would take her family with her. In 1939, with the Second World War beginning, Olive was 55. She attempted to join the Australian Army once again as a driver, but was told she was too old. Never to take no for an answer, she studied inspection skills at the Commonwealth Government Aircraft School and became an examiner at the de Havilland Aircraft Factory from 1942 to 1944. Even in her later years, she remained physically energetic and active. She particularly enjoyed ice skating, tennis, and surfing. She was a prolific writer, particularly dabbling in verse and short stories, but she published very little, though she did take up bookbinding as a hobby. All in all, she was devoted to her father and family. Despite her romance with Captain Jovovich, she would never marry, and in 1956, Olive May Kelso King moved to Melbourne and would pass away on the 1st of November 1958 at the age of 73 of natural causes. She would be cremated shortly afterwards. Part of me wishes we knew the proper fate of Ella, though. Olive King was a pioneer in both fields of exploration and also the ideals of feminism. When faced with opposition from men on her wishes to serve, to travel, or to whom she chose to keep her company, she persevered, she adapted, and she overcame, and in the process she became a folk hero to the Serbian people and an inspiration for all Australians. She not only did her job, but she excelled in it, and for that we are forever thankful. And there you have it, that's the story of Sergeant Olive May Kelso King. Next time on the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, he served 80 years ago, but up until recently was lost to history. He is believed to be the only sailor recovered from Australia's worst maritime disaster when his lifeboat washed ashore 3 months after the sinking of the HMAS Sydney. Next time on the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, I look into the life, service, disappearance, and legacy of the unknown sailor, able seaman Thomas Welsby Clark. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, a Doc Network production. I would really appreciate it and would help out the show if you would share this or leave a comment on Spotify or Google Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts, as it really helps others find the show. If you want to know more about today's episode with photos, show notes, and transcripts, head over to www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on IWODMJ on Instagram. Don't worry, there'll be a link in the description. If you want to follow me for more history hijinks and random nerdery, you can follow me on practically everything at DocWinters. Once again, my name is Ross. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. Bye.